there, sweet peas. Welcome back to Friendless. I'm your host, James Avramenko, and this week's episode is a brand new interview recorded live at the Book Warehouse on Main Street, right here in Vancouver, with an absolutely incredible guest, Eddy Boudel Tan. We discuss his latest novel, which is also my favorite read of the year so far, The Tiger and the Cosmonaut, which leads us to discussing everything from the weight of identity, the cost of compliance, Asian rage, what it means to go home when home doesn't really exist anymore, and why maybe we could all care a little less about defining who we are. So lean back, get comfy, set your volume at a reasonable level, and enjoy my interview with Eddy Boudel Tan here on Friendless.
To begin with, a question I love to ask all my guests because it evokes any number of reactions. Eddy, who the hell are you?
Who am I? Oh, wow. This is going to get really existential. Who am I? I ask myself that every day.
Don't we all?
In the year. Yeah. I haven't come up with a satisfactory answer. But I suppose a part of me is an author. And I live in Vancouver, born and raised. I consider myself to be a true blue Vancouverite. I even miss the rain when it hasn't been around for some time. I think there's rain in my blood. I spend so much time on the seawall. I have been known to show up at lunch wearing yoga gear head to toe. So
Really dyed in the wool.
that guy, yeah, that's it. But I also write books, and yeah. So The Tiger and the Cosmonaut is. I like how you call it brand new, but believe it or not, it's over a year old now. I know, which is crazy. Last week, we celebrated its first anniversary, birthday. I don't know what I like calling it. But
The book anniversary.
just over a year. The book anniversary, I like that.
Right? It's,
But,
it's yours.
thank you. And it's been a thrilling ride. What else am I? So I'm a second generation Chinese Canadian by way of China and Brunei. So my grandparents, my ancestors come from Hainan province, China, and fled China during the war and settled in Brunei as refugees, where my parents were born and raised. And then my parents moved to Canada when they were a young couple, and they got married. They first moved to Edmonton, so I could have been an Albertan, but dodged that.
We're both Albertans. I was about to say congratulations.
Thumbs down to all the Albertans listening. I think very highly of Alberta and Alberta. But yeah, my parents ended up settling in Vancouver, which is where I was born, and I'm thankful that they did, because I love the ocean. It's the most important thing, and so I couldn't imagine myself living in a landlocked place.
It's rough, especially like after you've seen the ocean, because I can, I wouldn't be so bold as to be like, I remember the first time I saw the ocean. Like, I feel like I can kind of remember the first time I sort of felt it in a way, because when you grow up in, I grew up in Calgary, and it's like, the mountains are incredible, but there's something about just like the vastness of the ocean, and just like when you get to certain places where it just never ends. It's something else. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
and I've spoken to people who have grown up on the prairies. And it's interesting because I've heard often from people who grow up in the prairies that when they're on the coast by the ocean, they feel claustrophobic. They feel hemmed in. And so being in a place like Vancouver, where you have the ocean, and then you have rivers and inlets, and then the mountains, I can see that. But from my perspective, I feel the opposite.
Well, I guess I definitely understand that, because the mountains kind of act as this sort of like cage in a way, and they're hard to, at times it feels like I couldn't even afford to escape if I wanted to, right? Because just to get over the mountains, it's right. But there's something about, when you're in the prairies, it's because it's the same sort of aesthetic, but like you can walk in them, in the same way you couldn't do that in the ocean, like you're. But I kind of like that. It's what's the word for it? It's like, it's like you're in utero. It's kind like you're encased, right? Yeah.
It feels very cozy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it blows my mind every time I fly back home, because flying over the mountains, one really realizes how vast the wilderness is past grouse and cypress.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just mountains and mountains as far as the eye can see,
Mhm.
and really just adds the perspective.
This kind of jumps ahead a little bit in some of the questions I had for you, but the town that you created, which is not springing to my mind at the moment, Wilhelm.
British
Thank
Columbia.
you, Wilhelm. I spent a few summers in working in Barkerville up north, and so I'm very familiar with Wells and Quesnel and Prince George and all those places, and Wilhelm really evoked the the feeling of those towns, but it also, like you say, the wilderness that's right there, and you don't even really realize it. And just I don't know what the right word for it is, but there's there's sort of a danger, and there's also a sadness around that too, though, because you think about, there's all that forest, but then they've also clear cut it in a way that if you go over a certain valley, you just see an empty field, and I wonder sometimes if they track flight records for that too, or like flight paths.
Sure.
For that, to be like, no, I swear, there's still trees, But that might be too conspiracy minded,
Yeah, I wanted to create a place that was isolated, and for anyone listening or watching, Wilhelm, the town in which The Tiger and the Cosmonaut takes place, is not a real place.
Yeah.
Because I get people asking me this all the time. They ask, "Where is Wilhelm?
Yeah.
What is this place? I looked it up on the map and I couldn't find it. Like this place doesn't exist. You made it up." And the answer is yes, I did. And then the next question is inevitably, so you base it off of Seashell, right? Or you base it off of Nelson or Merritt. I get all of these comparable towns, and it's funny to hear that. And I love speaking with British Columbians about this because they're just so passionate about what the story is set in our province, and they really want to determine what inspired this place.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter what town they throw at me, I always answer yes. Yeah, it is inspired by that, because it is Seashell, but it's also Nelson, and it's also Merritt. I really wanted to create a town that could be any and every town in British Columbia, and not because every town in British Columbia is the same, because that's very much untrue. Every town is so different and distinct, but I wanted to create a place that could feel like home to anyone who grew up in a small town. And this idea of Wilhelm as a town, as a place, was really, I did it in a way to just, I guess, illustrate or reflect how dangerous oversimplifying can be. I think when, people think of British Columbia, certain images come to mind, right? James, Will, I don't know, as Albertans, you might be able to attest to that.
Yep.
I think some people come to BC expecting us all to be hugging trees and marching to save old growth forests every day, and that every bathroom is gender neutral, and we're eating sushi every morning. And there's probably a bit of truth in all of that. But it's a lot more complicated.
Exactly.
Than that, right? Yeah. BC is not only one thing. And while a lot of those stereotypes might have a bit of truth, the real truth is a lot more complicated. And such is the case with Wilhelm, which Wilhelm on the surface seems to be this very progressive, if not self-righteous place, a place that really prides itself and enlightened and likes to project that image. But beneath the surface, it's a lot more complicated.
I'm gonna circle back to the Wilhelm stuff, because I have some deeper questions about that. But I want to, I realized I didn't really set up the novel very well. I kind of just dove in, and so I will circle back a little bit. So the main narrator, Casper, when the story opens, he's already carrying decades worth of grief and secrets and shame that he's never had a chance to say aloud. I'm going to do my best to not be too spoilery with the interview, but it might come out. I don't know. We'll find out. But
And a little hint here and there.
right, exactly. Yeah. So beginning with Casper himself, as you're writing someone like that, what does it feel like as an author to be building a character who's kind of learned to be so fluent in avoidance. And do you feel like that comes out of your own predisposition, or is that an observed from somewhere else?
Oh, this is getting deep.
Just immediately cut it. Yeah. So what's your attachment style?
Right.
You know?
Right. Therapeutic. So what I will say up front is this book isn't about me or my life, and Casper is not me. And just like how this book isn't about my family, although the family depicted in this book share a lot of traits and similarities with my family, it's really the family at the center of the story is meant to, in a way, represent any Chinese Canadian family with second generation children. And so even though it's not about my family, it's about families like mine. And I think to a certain extent, the same can be said about Casper. Everything in this novel, has a bit of me in my life and my lived experience threaded throughout it, even if it's not a reflection of me. Writing Casper's character was really interesting because I set out to write a story about the experience of being second generation Canadian. And so I can only speak to my experience as a second generation Chinese Canadian, but the way that I would describe that experience is it can sometimes feel as if I were caught between cultures, having to or feeling some pressure to honor my parents' heritage, to honor all of the sacrifices they made to be here, amidst all of these comments about and stories about everything that my parents gave up to come here to give me and my brothers a chance at a better life. And then on the flip side, just wanting to be Canadian, right? Yeah. Just wanting to play street hockey and to just be accepted as Canadian without people interrogating where I'm from and where my family are from and why I don't have an accent. That's just what I wanted growing up. And so that's what that experience felt like for me. But then even more deeply, there are just other, elements or nuances of what that experience can feel like. So coming from a second generation Chinese Canadian background, my experience has been very much this one in which I have these certain expectations of, right? So you might have heard of the model minority and what comes with that, this idea that Asian Canadians and Americans especially are given access to certain privilege and prosperity, but only if we, meet certain criteria, we toe the line, exactly, we play nice. Yeah. And in a way, perhaps my community has created this image or persona of the obedient, rule-abiding citizen. And, just like we talked about with oversimplification, the truth is obviously a lot more complicated. But, I think there's having to, first of all, acknowledging that there is that expectation and that mold exists, and then also feeling like one has to fit that mold and meet that expectation in order to get ahead in life, in order to act with privilege and prosperity. That has some really dehumanizing effects on a person and on one's sense of self and identity. And so part of this, part of the reason that I wanted to write this book was I wanted to explore what happens when people who come from that community, who contend with those expectations every day, just decide that they've had enough, and they decide that the system's no longer working for them, and they try to the best of their ability to reclaim their true sense of self and identity. And so writing Casper's character was really interesting in that way because it really is an exploration of second generation Chinese Canadian identity.
Something that I loved so much, and again, this is not, I'll dance as far away from the end as possible, but something that became very impactful for me is this idea of how rapidly things can change, even though we think that they're ingrained. We think that these are forever, whatever they might be, norms or traditions or anything, and then they can flip. And then they're gone, and there's sort of no, suddenly in retrospect, we're like, how could that possibly have ever lasted as long as it, And I think that climax of the story really evokes a lot of that sort of sentiment, you know. You know, obviously the story isn't directly you. In the past, I had read an interview or a quote of yours saying that a piece of the inspiration for writing was kind of reckoning with your parents' aging, and that was something that really struck me. There's a passage around very early on around realizing that your parents aren't waiting for you at that they're on to their next peak while you're at yours, and that really caught me. But you know, that feeling of running out of time and reckoning with what was sacrificed and what can you still achieve. And I'm wondering, I guess, how much of that urgency in the inspiration do you feel ended up within the book, and how much do you feel sort of just stayed within kind of the notebook, if you will, you know, for you to just reckon with on your own?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because a lot of it did end up in the notebook and not in the book.
Yeah.
Because when I first set out to write this story, a part of the inspiration or a part of the motivation was this reckoning that I was going through, that my parents were aging. And this was happening at the onset of the pandemic. So, and I also think it was a part of my stage in life. You know, I was in my mid-30s. All of my friends seemed to be confronting the same fears. We just started to realize that, hey, our parents look older. They are aging, moving into a different phase in life. And on top of that, there's a deadly virus that's ravaging people, in which the elderly are more susceptible to. And so that feeling just became really acute. And I did feel this urgency to honor their stories and their experiences in a way. And also I felt this need to almost make up for everything that they had sacrificed.
Sure.
And for me and my brothers coming here. And so during that time, and this was also amidst a really troubling rise in anti-Asian racism, I really felt this hunger to learn more about my parents. I started asking the questions that at the age of 35, I had never asked my parents before. It's sad, but better late than never.
Yeah.
And I would sit them down and take them out for a meal and ask them to tell me what it was like to move to Canada, you know, when they were 20. And they told me such fascinating stories about, you know, sure, there was difficulty, sure, there was discrimination, but it was also a big adventure for them.
Sure,
moving to a new country and moving from a tropical country to a place like Edmonton. Having the Calgarians are laughing. And having to shop for a winter coat for the first time.
Yeah.
They told me stories about riding a roller coaster for the first time and then almost losing their purse. It was just really, I have a lot of fond memories of that time because I had a chance to really delve more deeply into their histories. And I wanted to honor that in some way.
I feel like I had a very similar experience with my dad around that same time. And I do feel like if I had asked him even 5, 10 years earlier, I wouldn't have had the same reception or reaction or appreciation.
Every moment count. Tomorrow is never guaranteed. And yeah, so I'm happy that I came around eventually and had that curiosity. And yeah, I enjoy this time. But it was like, it did feel very uncomfortable also, just because there was that urgency and no one's getting any younger.
Well, you don't want to say, hey, I know you might die soon, so do you want to tell me some story? Right?
Yeah, that's not the best.
But you are right, and it's one of those things that I think that we had a chance to collectively reckon with it in that window, and instead I feel like we were more driven to, that whole like back to normal thing, right? And we kind of missed that window, and I really appreciate people who took that time to reckon with it, because I think that we have this predisposition to think that we're owed a third act. And my therapist loves to always, whenever I'm like, well, I'm in the back half of my life, and he's like, yeah, if you're so lucky, he's like, don't trick yourself, it could be tomorrow, right? And so I think that reminder and then the appreciation of it, it deepens everything, right?
Yeah, it truly does. And people are always changing too. And yeah, I mean, I'm constantly changing, they're constantly changing, and so yeah, I value every moment I have with my family, and I value it more and more. And I sometimes this is gonna get grim, but every now and again, I'm gonna share this with you because every now and again I get this fleeting thought, and the thought is, what if this is the happiest I'll ever be? Like, what if everything goes downhill from here?
Yeah.
Because I've got my health. My husband has his health. We have a happy, full life. Both sets of our parents are alive and healthy. And everything we need is more or less abundant. And we feel fulfilled in life. And sometimes I think, all of this can be taken away just like that. And, we're not always going to be healthy. And our parents aren't always going to be healthy. And so I get this really morbid thought sometimes, thinking, this could be it. This could be the happiest I'll ever be, and it can all change tomorrow. But, the, I guess, uplifting part of that is knowing how ephemeral everything is. It does force us to be more present and more grateful. As cheesy as that sounds, every time I have that morbid thought, I think to myself, my next thought is always, yeah, so this is true. Could be right. So, make the most of today.
Enjoy it.
And that tends to be a positive way of looking at it.
The irony of that is I don't see that as grim at all. I think that's just deeply aware of the reality, and I mean, the joy of a thought like that is that there is no answer to it. You're right. It could be. It also could not be. Who knows? You might win the lottery. Who knows? Right? Like you just got shortlisted, like with the killer, like, it's like, that better be making you happy,
Sure.
But it reminds me of that. There's a Kurt Vonnegut story of his uncle. He would always stop in the middle of, a nice thing, and he'd stop and he'd say aloud, he'd go, if this isn't nice, what is? And it was his reminder, and it was one of his like commencement speeches that he would always give, and he'd say, so I hope if you take one thing, it's whenever anything's like nice and soft and gentle, even if it's small and momentary, you just stop and you say aloud, this is nice, what is, right? And I think again, it's that same thing of we're kind of conditioned to not reckon with that stuff. We're conditioned with the belief of, capitalism will only ever go up and it'll only ever, right, and all those things, and that there's this delusion of perpetuity, and when you look at things realistically, that doesn't mean it's depressing. It just means it's, I come from the DBT school of thought, dialectical behavior therapy stuff around, radical acceptance is like, yeah, you will die. Sorry, but like, yeah. And you can scream and yell and throw a tantrum, but that's not going to change that,
Absolutely.
And so you better enjoy what you do get, right?
And I think as we age also, we become more resilient and we become more accepting of that. When I was younger, one of my, if not my greatest fear was losing everything.
Yeah.
So much so that I wrote a book about it, my first book, Fear Elias. It was all about that fear of losing everything, that one day everything will be taken away, because in that novel, the protagonist, Cohen, he does quite literally lose everything in a day. It follows him as he grapples with that. And I wrote that book in part to deal with my fear at the time of losing everything. And I've changed since then. So that was 6 years ago, and I no longer feel the same fear. And when I do have that thought of the happiest I'll ever be, it's not, it doesn't make me feel scared. It doesn't make me feel anxious. It's just an acknowledgement. And so I think as we age, we do become more resilient to that and more understanding of it. Something that actually helped me when I had that fear is the Buddhist teaching of impermanence. And I don't identify as Buddhist, but I certainly respect a lot of their principles. And in that principle especially, just this idea of impermanence, the fact that everything is impermanent. Nothing is forever. It's all temporary. And as soon as we accept that, the healthier our outlook on life can be, because we no longer feel the need to hold on so tightly, because it's futile.
Literally can't. Exactly.
No matter how hard you hold, it's still going to slip out of your hands at some point. And there's something really liberating.
It makes it a lot more fun. You know,
Kind of.
it opens the
YOLO.
door for a little, right? Exactly. You know, it's like you might as well just whatever. You know, and I mean, of course, then the fun comes in. Like that doesn't mean just go be a flippant jerk off. You know, like it's like, but it's just allowing, you know, taking that pressure off yourself, right, and allowing yourself to just be like, yeah, you know, this is, you know, my one kick the can. To circle it back to something more dour, you know.
Things are getting a bit too uplifting.
Right, we're too positive here. We got to bring it back down to earth. You know, there's this really beautiful parallel around the sort of the interior journey of almost the kind of dread of a young queer person, just kind of home, you know, and the tension around wanting to be seen and being terrified of the same recognition, right? And that, you know, the fear of authenticity, while also there's this kind of like suspense thriller going on. You know, there's disappearances and there's, you know, liars and there's these two parallels kind of playing. Was that sort of a structural decision from the very beginning, or is that something that you were discovering as characters are talking to you, as things are happening?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of both. So I have a lot of fun taking something that seems familiar and then just flipping the script or subverting it some way. So in this case, what I took was your typical boy goes back to their hometown type of story, right? And they automatically and immediately revert back to that troubled, insecure person that they were when they left. And so I decided that was
I imagined his voice went up like 1 or 2 octaves at first, right? You know,
But there's so much truth in that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, whether we're returning to our hometown or even just going back to our parents' home, there's something about being back or revisiting and like a familiar phase in our past phase in our lives that just almost transforms us back to the person that we were during that phase in life. I wanted to take that structure of a story or that nut of a story, subvert it in a way, have some fun with it. And so that was something of a structural decision. But something that I do often hear from readers is how much that element of the story really resonated with them. That feeling of going home and just feeling really not at home while they're home.
Yeah.
Like feeling as if they couldn't be themselves and they had to be someone else. Like they had to play a role, whether it would be the role that their family or people in their lives demanded them to play, or reverting back to who they were at that point in their lives. And it was really interesting to just hear people.
It always reminds me of I think it's a Gertrude Stein quote of saying that there is no there. And it's this idea of like, they're kind of, in a lot of ways, there is no going back. And yet there is also this bizarre, like spiritual regression, even though it's not the same place, you know, because you're not going back and yet it feels like you are, right? You know, and I mean, I'm in the same boat. I'm one of those readers saying like, I've had that experience where I'm like having this almost like double deja vu of like remembering what the house was while also seeing it as it is right now, you know, and it's a very alienating feeling, you know, it's lonely. It's a lonely feeling to realize. I mean, again, it's like we're talking about, it's like, it's just that feeling of time passing, you know, and when time almost feels like a physical object, you know, and you realize it's much further away from you than you thought, you know.
So true. Yeah. And it's, I guess, compounded for people who grow up queer.
Yeah.
Right. And so in this novel, Casper goes home, but he's not just going home. He's also bringing home a partner, a male partner for the first time to his parents' home. And there's so many more pressing and urgent things happening, but the thing that he's most anxious about is his mother going to demand that they sleep in separate rooms, right? Or how are they going to react to this boyfriend that he's bringing home and all the slights that he sees his boyfriend be subjected to? And so I think that element just makes it that much richer, more complex, because at least for me, I can attest to my experience growing up queer. I was playing a role, you know, the person that I was when I was a teenager, it was not truly me. That was me mirroring my male friends, pretending that I loved hockey, basketball. Jennifer Lopez. You know, it's, although I do love Jennifer
I was
Lopez.
gonna say I loved her.
Not in a way.
Yeah.
I claim. So it's a different kind of love.
Yeah.
And so that just makes it so much more complicated because I think so many queer people can relate to this feeling of playing a role. But even at the time, we're so young that I don't know if I realized I was playing a role. I was just trying to figure out who I was.
That's just
and
it.
so I wasn't consciously putting on a show and performing. I was just modeling behavior that I saw around me, trying to figure it out.
That, I mean, like, you're talking to a guy I was the only boy in dance class.
Oh, good for you.
Thank you. I remember, it wasn't quite as like comical as like the fist was in the air as they were, the jocks were surrounding me, but it was close. But it was one of those like, why are you in dance class? And for me, I was like, because I want to dance, right? But I had to be like, because, I'm the only guy, and there's so many girls around, even though in the head I was just like,
No one's
because I want to
buying
learn. I was like, I was so convinced they bought it. I was so convinced.
Bless you.
But there is, there's that direct, but there's also like, I think you're spot on that. Like, I don't think that anyone at that age, I mean, I maybe shouldn't speak with such a broad stroke, but it doesn't feel like many of us are that self-aware, and
You just wanted to dance.
literally. But it was one of those like, it just you have no idea who you are, and you're just trying stuff on, and you see, oh, this makes me. It's not even that it makes me feel safer. It's just that it's like this means I'm not the target for a little, and so it's like, okay, better lean into that,
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's adolescence in a sentence, isn't it? I mean, just trying to assimilate so that you don't get the negative attention, so that the negative attention can be directed elsewhere.
Right. It's oh my God, horrific what we do to children. On the show, I'm often looking at the idea of this sort of nuance between the idea of being alone versus being lonely, and how those things can sometimes be different. And I think the book evokes a version of that in the way that, Casper is, surrounded by his family, he's got his partner, he's got, he's in his hometown, and yet he is still so isolated. He's still so alone inside himself, I was going to ask about family stuff leading out of that, but we've kind of tapped into it. And I just think that he's an incredible character, and it's like it's just one of those like, how do you expect readers to respond to him when you think of, he's going to his hometown because his father's disappeared and he's worried about where his boyfriend's going to sleep, and and it's like the sort of dichotomy of that pressure, How did you expect readers to take him in sort of on first blush?
Well, I want people to relate to him, to see a bit of themselves in him. I think there's something really true about this feeling of being lonely. And if you're surrounded by people, especially in a city like Vancouver, and especially when one feels as if the people around them don't really know the true them. And I think that applies to Casper's case, even with his boyfriend, Anthony. So he's been with Anthony for 4 years. If anyone can understand and appreciate Casper for who he is, it's Anthony, right? But even around Anthony, Anthony doesn't realize that Casper had a twin brother.
Yeah, he doesn't even know.
Yeah. Anthony soon realizes that Casper's been keeping all of these pretty fundamental bits of information from him. And so I think a lot of Casper's loneliness comes from the fact that he has been keeping people out, and he has been guarding himself, his true self, from those around him. And imagine how isolating.
Yeah, I mean, he's doing that classic, I hate you, don't leave me. He's pushing away, but while being like, where are you, right?
That's so human, though, eh?
I think that's what I find so fascinating about him is that, and so many of the characters in the book is that, as you said, you don't want them to be just this flattened, whether it's a stereotype or whatever it might be, they're so human, and they're so just, they're messy, and they're really complicated, and they're not, if you were to just sort of break down their behaviors, they're not technically that likable.
Sure.
But you get it. You get what they're going through. You get why they're doing it. And the more you sit with them, and the more you listen to them, the more you understand, like, yeah, this choice had these repercussions, but like, what else could I do? You know?
You didn't find them likable?
Well, I did. I actually really did, in the sense that, like, so like the older brother, right? The older brother who like is purposely, it feels like purposely introduced to be like kind of antagonistic and a little bit of a shit, you know, right? But is also like a sweetie, you know, and also is like so righteously justified, you know, just so valid in his points and in his, you know. I wanted to hear a lot more from him, actually. I wanted to know more about him, because I wanted to know, like, why did he run away? You know, why did he, you know, and what was his, right? Because if it's going to lead you to what he did, there's got to be something else, you know, right? But maybe that's a sequel. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just messing with you about that likability question.
Yeah.
But it goes back to what we were talking about with oversimplification.
Exactly.
And so, I know I love it when a reader assumes that a character is going to be one way, but they turn out to be something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Ricky, the brother, is a good example.
So you know, you mentioned even in the interview, you already brought up this idea of the Asian Canadians being expected to fit this mold, obedient, polite, submissive. And Casper and his siblings have clearly absorbed those expectations in similar and also very different ways. And I'm curious, how do you see the cost of that compliance across their generation? And what I guess it would be your generation as well. And how do you see that being reckoned with and addressed and shifted for the coming generation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
During the first meeting with my editor, and this was before the book deal and before everything else, I had a virtual meeting with my editor, someone who I respected and wanted so badly to work with. And he asked me what this book was about. He wanted me to put in my own words. That was the first question he asked. My answer was, this is a book about Asian rage. And it wasn't really planned.
Sure.
You know, I think it was a thought that was festering somewhere, but I don't think I'd ever articulated this book in quite that way. Yeah. So I was somewhat surprised when that was my answer. And
it's actually a fantastic summary of the book. It feels like, hell yeah. Right? It's kind of what it feels like it is in the outcome as well, right? You know, I don't think you lost that.
Yeah. And it certainly caught his attention. Mm-hmm. But then he asked me to unpack that, and so on the fly I had to unpack that in real time. And so you know, I had to untangle my thoughts around what I meant by this book being about Asian rage. And really what I arrived at was the rage that comes from minimizing oneself, from making oneself more palatable, being submissive because that's what society demands of us. And so I do think that there is this angering effect that might happen with people who are being subjected. And I've certainly seen that in my lived experience. I look around myself in my community of Asian Canadians, and I do think that there are these expectations put on us that aren't necessarily placed on people outside of that. And I do think that a product of that can be anger, a desire to push back against those demands to prove that we are more than just obedient, rule-abiding, submissive, polite citizen. I grew up being acutely aware of people's expectations of me, and I was never one to make myself smaller for that reason. I would actually, and I still do, I think, I would find myself speaking more loudly than people might expect me to, or just being bigger and just demanding more space than I might be normally afforded. And that was my way, perhaps my petty way of pushing back against those expectations. I think I learned a lot of that from my parents because, you know, there are a lot of these stereotypes about what Chinese Canadian parents are like. And the parents depicted in this reflect some of those stereotypes. They're very law-abiding. They're very fearful. They a lot of their decisions are made based on avoiding these imagined outcomes, like being exiled from Canada or having their wealth and opportunity taken away. But my parents were never like that. My parents were like, they would put you in your place. And you know, for example, there's a scene in the book in which the family go to a diner and it's for one of the children's birthdays, and they have a reservation, but they're made to wait. And they end up waiting and waiting because it's 1990s small town BC, and families like theirs don't get seated before the other families in town. And I've experienced like that. I've had an experience very similar to that, except instead of waiting obediently like what the father does in the novel, my father went up to the manager and he demanded to be sat. Nice. And it escalated, and I was horrifically embarrassed. So yeah, then my dad wasn't happy, and he pulled us and my brothers, and we marched out of the restaurant. And looking back, I really appreciate that quality in my parents, and that they refuse to minimize themselves, to make themselves smaller and weaker, just to meet these demands of society.
Yeah. So that leads into the last sort of big thought that I really wanted to tease out, and it's something that, you know, so there's you know, Wilhelm is sort of the, you know, the every town in a way, you know, but it you know, it has a very specific kind of racial hierarchy within itself. You know, the disappearance of the white boy takes a precedent over you know, Sam, because of this ingrained status. You know, on top of that, Casper's coming into Vancouver out of the Vancouver queer scene, where he makes direct comments about feeling like at times a fetish object, and you know, sort of just this like collectible exotic item, right? None of these places know him as a human, right? But a thought that kind of sprang out of that was this idea of, we talk about, you know, he says, you know, the city treats me like this, right? The town treats us like this. But it's like the city is just inert building. The city's concrete. The city, you know, the sort of machinations, the machine are individual behaviors. It's a person behaving a way and then somebody else doing something similar, and the reciprocation of the system, right? And that cycle. And the way you said, you know, you didn't play the game. You would speak up when they expected me to be quiet. And I'm curious, in your experience and in your, you know, just in your perspective, do you see it as, there's a few pieces here I think that we can scratch at, but to begin with, do you see it as, you know, where do you see that machine, or where do you see those expectations beginning? Is it our perception of the individual, or is it, you know, the multitude kind of beyond us? Does that make sense?
It does,
yeah. Okay.
I think it begins with this sense of othering, that we don't belong. Growing up, I grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver, and it was the 90s. And like, I can't tell you how many times people would ask me, "So where are you from? You look so exotic." And I would say, "Oh, I was born in Grace Hospital," which is now BC Children's Hospital, you know, 30 minutes away. And inevitably, they would not be satisfied with that answer, and they would ask, "No, where are you from? Where are you from?" And or they would just lose their patience and say, "You know what I mean?" And of course I knew what they meant, but I'm not going to with satisfaction. But if I'm not from Canada, then where am I from? Am I from Brunei? Am I from China? It was a very complicated question to answer. But I think that's where it begins, is this sense of you either belong or you don't.
Yes.
And so what is the criteria to belong? Well, if being born in this country doesn't meet that criteria of belonging, then what does? And I don't need to spell it out, but I think I know, right? And so I think it starts there. And another thing that I'll say is, from my experience, racism, discrimination, it's very seldom overt. It's very seldom explicit. Like, I have been called slurs, but that's pretty rare. Like, more often it's like a microaggression, a slight, a stereotype. It is, being described things like exotic, right? It's this sense of othering, but it could also be a lot more malicious, but also implicit. And it can be done with humor, and it's often done with humor, in which, someone will make an offensive joke and just brush it off as, hey, they're just being funny. Like, don't be so sensitive about it.
But that's how you push those things forward. That's called grooming. That's how you push it along, right?
And that's also how it becomes systemic. It's very much ingrained in our society. And so sometimes I get in conversation with someone who just doesn't think that Canada has a racism problem because they believe this beautiful image of Canada being a lovely mosaic in which we can all honor our differences and live in harmony. And as much as I love to believe and accept that, I have eyes and ears, and I know that the truth is not quite so simple.
It was really that was a fun lesson in grade 3. Right? When you got to color the map. Oh, it was a great day.
Totally. It's a beautiful fest. And I do understand there are a lot of really well-meaning people who just really believe that. They want to believe that. And they haven't seen any evidence otherwise. But they haven't seen any evidence because they're not living in my skin. Right? And so they haven't lived through the same overt and implicit or implied acts of discrimination. And so it's interesting talking to people like that who actually don't think that racism exists in Canada.
It's like not a thing to laugh about, but it's like, how do you not just
But I mean, how am I going to prove that to you? Though?
Yeah. Well, and then that's I think that takes the step deeper of like, so how do we shift it? Because it's not me trying to say that it's like it takes two to tango or something around racism. Is that it's like that it's that's way too close to like, well, what were you wearing type behavior, But it's like it's this idea of like, there's the social contract, right? And there's these societal norms. But I'm like, I guess there's a part of me that's like, where did we learn those? Because it doesn't feel like they're ever actually said aloud, and yet somehow we all implicitly learned them. And is it? Do you think it's through just the trial and error of childhood, where we see stuff and we're like, oh, I guess that must mean this, like, or is there just this like, or is it like, or all the racist families are like telling their kids and then they're like, but shh, don't tell us, don't tell anyone, like I don't know. I just it's because I don't I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just like I'm so fascinated by like where does it stem from and where does that get learned if it's not being overtly communicated? How do we now know it exists, right? Or how are we perpetuating it? I guess.
Maybe there is a secret racism school.
Maybe there is, right?
Wouldn't be surprised. It's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that. Yeah. But I do think a lot of it comes from fear. And like there are legitimate fears out there, people who are losing work, people who are losing their homes, people and they have legitimate fears, but they need someone to blame. Right. And who's easier to blame than the outsiders?
Yeah.
Whether they be the immigrants or the refugees or the indigenous communities that live on residences or the queer community or drag queens who just want to read storybooks to children in libraries. Right. And so I think fear brings out the worst in us. And, that I don't know if it's a learned tendency or whether it's learned by the culture around them. But I do think that we tend to absorb the values and the viewpoints of those closest to us. And the child is going to learn based on how their parent is behaving and the things that they say and the things that they do and the people that they surround themselves with. And so that training is just passed on subconsciously.
Do you think it's a like I'm getting too esoteric with these questions now. I'm just so curious. This is stuff that fascinates me, and it's just this question of like, it's
Go
like
for it. Let's get weird.
Well, it's the question of like, is the machine the individual? Is the individual the machine? It's almost like that. Like, what is it? It's not Kampala, but it's like the as above, so below, the one and the all type stuff. And it's so. When I hear things like the culture, it's like, what does that mean? Like, what even is that? We're all part of the queer community, but it's like, what even is that? What's is the queer community the birdhouse, or is the queer community the bathhouse, or is it like what like what does that even mean? When it's like it's people, and I think in a way sometimes I feel hesitant around using those kind of like collective words, because I feel like it erases the responsibility of the individual, and it allows us to sort of, again, like in high school, it allows us to sort of be like, well, I'm in the community, so I'm doing good enough, and that means like, don't look over here, and I guess I'm like trying to find ways, and I hate to put you on the spot here, but it's like, your characters come up with certain ways to break the molds, and I'm wondering, is there some direction you would hope that, whether it's readers or listeners or just people might engage on an individual level in order to build that collective shift?
I do think it's very human to assimilate.
Yeah.
Just like how we talked about, being in the schoolyard, wanting to just be like everyone else as we're trying to figure it out. Yes, I think as we age, we get a better sense of self and a better sense of identity, but that's also not equally true for everyone. I think there are a lot of people out there, regardless of their age, who are just trying to figure it out. They're still trying to figure out who they are. And the easiest way to do that is to assimilate, even though I don't think most people would describe it like that, but they're modeling their behaviors and their viewpoints based off those around them. And we see this in groupthink, but we also see this in echo chambers online, in which everyone is just spewing the same opinions and hot takes, and like the collective tends to amalgamate into a majority much of the time. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Like when you ask about what the queer community is, I think that community, part of the reason that community is so important is because there are so many queer people out there who just don't know how to be queer. They don't know what they should be doing or what is available to them, and so they look to role models and they look to others within the community to help them figure it out. And so I think all of us are Casper in a way, in which we don't know what our identity is, because identity is so multifaceted and we can truly be so many things. And so we're all at different phases of just figuring it out. And like you talked about the ephemerality of it, how things are constantly changing, our identity is also constantly changing. And so I think there's just something really true and human about that.
And I think that it actually leaves it on a very hopeful note too, in that it's like just because you were something doesn't mean that's what you are, right?
So true.
I have so many more questions for you, but you're just so fascinating, and you have such fantastic answers to everything that I wanted to just let you cook, But I think to wrap up, this feels like it's going to end on a bit of a downer, but it's one of those. It sounds grim, but I think we can turn it positive, because talking about loneliness, talking about something that I've really been exploring is this idea of like the idea of like the grief of people who are still around, and just the grief that often lives between spaces between people who love each other as well. And I'm curious, within that exploration, what did writing this book teach you about, whether it's about the stuff I highlighted, whether it's about, Asian rage or all the things that were going into the impulse to write this book. What did the book teach you about those things in the end?
That's a really good one. I think something that this book taught me, or something that I realized while writing this book, is perhaps we put too much focus on identity. It's one of those words where everything's about identity these days, and everyone cares about their identity. But what is identity exactly, and why is it so necessary for us to define it and articulate it and label it and categorize it. And like, it's so multifaceted. It's so complex. Like, I often say that I'm a walking contradiction because I am. Like, I'm so contradictory. And even my closest friends will say things like, that's not like you. Like, yeah, it's not, but you know, it also is because it is today. Exactly. And so writing this book, since this book is very much about identity, about the complexities of identity and also the limitations of identity, something that I realized is, I don't know, perhaps I don't care about identity, and perhaps I cared too much, and perhaps people care too much about identity. I hope that doesn't come across as because I do think that for many people, you know, arriving at an understanding of their identity is so important and also really elusive and difficult to do. And so I don't want to downplay the importance of that. But
it's almost like my therapist always says, awareness is half the battle.
Sure.
So it's like, just by finding out who you are, that's only the front half. And I think the back half is actually learning to like decouple yourself and like de-anchor yourself from it, you know? Yeah, because I think you're spot on. There's so many people are desperate to find that they then, that almost becomes their identity, is the search, when it's like, the liberation is being like, this is where I'm at today. You know?
Why can't we just be?
Yeah.
And I think the dangers of that, we see evidence of that all around us, in which people are so desperate for something to define their identity by that they go all in on conspiracy theories or
like
racism,
Buddhist separatists,
or,
you know, like
they find these things to define who they are. Who they are is so much more interesting. Has so much more potential. And I think it also kind of goes back to our conversation around oversimplification. And I do think that identity, the way that we often view it, is inherently an oversimplification, right? If you were to define your identity, if any of us were to define our identity, we'd be really oversimplifying and really minimizing who we actually are. And so, you know, I think that really ties into that notion really well.
I just realized, I think that's maybe a subconscious reason why I like to start the interviews with who are you? You know, right?
Really way to start.
Right?
You almost threw me. Answer that.
Eddy, thank you so much. This has been just so lovely talking to you.
Likewise.
The book is incredible. Like I say, I had a million other questions for you, but we'll find some other time maybe, or those will just live in the ether, you know?
Beautiful.
Do you have anywhere you would like, where would you like listeners to find you next? Where can we point them to? Social media, anything like that?
Yeah, come find me on Instagram at Eddy Automatic. That's Eddy with a Y. And for those of you in Vancouver, come find me at Book Warehouse in, I think, 2 weeks, because I'll be here doing an event with the brilliant authors Wiley Wei Chung Ho and Donacito in celebration of Asian Heritage Month. So if this is out before then please come on down to Book Warehouse on Main Street.
It will be. It'll be out a week before. So I'll make sure it's in all the info will be in the show notes. And I've been doing this for 7 years and I still don't have a sign off. So I always end up just kind of being like, okay, well, thanks so much. Good. Right. And that's it. Right.
It's got to be your signature.
Right.
And that's it. Thank you one more time to Eddy for chatting with me, for taking the time to come to the store and talk a lot of awkward nonsense. It was an absolute blast, and I've just been vibrating ever since we recorded that episode. If you want to find out more from Eddy, check him out on Instagram at Eddy Automatic. That is Eddy with a Y. And be sure to pick up The Tiger and the Cosmonaut at the Book Warehouse or any other independent bookstore near you. Thank you to Will, my brand new team member, for manning the camera. And thank you to Debbie and the whole team over at the Book Warehouse. As always, if this episode resonated, please share it with someone and leave a review if you haven't. It genuinely helps people find the show, and it's completely free. But that's going to do it for me, so let's wrap things up here. Thank you one more time for listening, and I hope I'll catch you back here in 2 weeks with another brand new episode. But as always, I'm not going to worry about that right now, and neither should you, because that is then, and this is now. So for now, I'll just say I love you, and I wish you well. Fun and safety, sweet peas.